In James McBride's latest novel, The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, we're in Pottstown, Pennsylvania in 1972. A human skeleton's been discovered at a construction site for a new housing development. Who holds the secrets of this discovery? The answer might be found among the residents of Chicken Hill, a neighborhood where immigrant Jews and African Americans have lived side by side for decades, sharing life's sorrows and joys and looking out for each other. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. Chicken Hill is the place where Moshe and Hannah Ludlow lived and where Hannah ran the Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, which served the neighborhood of diverse characters, African Americans and European immigrants. Moshe is a Romanian-born theater owner who integrated the town's first dance hall. When the state comes looking for Dodo, a deaf black child, with claims that the boy needed to be institutionalized, Chicken Hill residents come together to execute a plan to retrieve the boy, keep him safe, and give him the life that Hannah would have wanted for him and everyone else, a life of happiness in a safe and loving community. But the denizens of Chicken Hill won't have such an easy time of it. Their wider space in Pottstown is still one characterized by bigotry, hypocrisy, and inequality. How can the love that Hannah represents win out in protecting young Dodo and everyone else involved in the desire to ensure a community led by love and charity? I spoke to author James McBride about his latest novel, The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. So, The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. Can you set the table and tell us what this novel is about? It's about a lot of things, but I would like to hear this from you. What do you tell people when you tell them what this is about?
I just say it's a novel about, equality, I suppose, and the delight and satisfaction that comes with it.
When did the seedbed of this story first take root? Where did it come from? I mean, you've built this entire world with so many different characters and situations, but do you remember what the seed of the idea was, where it came from?
I suppose it began in the office of a man named Bill Saltzman in Philadelphia in 1976. I suppose I was 18 or 19, and I applied for a job as a dishwasher that I found in the paper in Philadelphia. My family moved to Philadelphia from New York when I was in college in my freshman year. But we arrived in Philadelphia, and I was a freshman at Oberlin, which is in Ohio, and I came home, not to New York, but I came home to Philadelphia. I needed a job. And I looked in the paper and I saw an ad for a dishwasher at a camp for so-called handicapped kids. And I applied, and I ended up, this man named Bill Saltzman called the camp director and said, I got a kid here. He said, I got a boy here. he said, I got a boy here who's just too smart to be a counselor. And he sent me to see the guy who ran the camp, whose name was Cy Friend. And, Cy was just great. He apologized for Bill Saltzman's language, which, frankly, I don't care what you call me so long as you don't call me late for dinner. But and Bill Saltzman was a very kind person, and, from a different generation. Long story short, I got a job at this camp for disabled kids. And it changed my life, so-called disabled children. And it really changed my whole life. I worked there for 4 summers, and the camp and the man who ran it changed my life. So I always wanted to write about it, but I never could figure out how to do it.
I've heard you say that before in an interview, that you couldn't find sort of an access point into writing about the Variety Club camp. You just couldn't do it. What was it this time? I mean, I feel like there's something with the story of Moses that we learn if we didn't know it before, and these other characters of Dodo, Hannah, and so forth. But they must have come well after you decided, obviously, okay, I'm going to write that Cy Friend story.
I mean, Hannah and Dodo and all of the other characters were really, parts of my life and my imagination that came about because what I really wanted to say in this book is that we are all pretty much alike, despite our cultural and racial and ethnic differences, so-called differences. And I wanted to say it in a way that wasn't boring, and in a way that was fun, and, in a way that's real. When I became a writer, and after writing, all the books that I've written, I tried to attack the story several times over the years. And I realized at a certain point that I just couldn't do it because I was writing about a camp, and it was just campy. The kids go to sleep and then they go to camp. I mean, even though this was a disabled children's camp, it was still camp, and it just felt corny, didn't feel real. But the only words that stood out was the chapter about Moshe, who in real life, in my imaginary real life, donated the land for the camp. And so when I pushed back into that part of the book, every time I got to that chapter, it was the only thing that really sung. Those words really, the scenes, not the words, but the idea, the spirit of it just sung off the page. And so I scrapped the rest of it after years and years of trying to make the camp scenes work and the characters. And I just went with Moshe, and he led me to everyone else. His wife Chona, and she led me to Bernice, her best friend, the black girl who was a neighbor, and then their songs began to intermingle until it became a kind of orchestra. You listen for the sound of your characters, you listen for the song they sing, and if you're lucky, you hear it, and then it finds its place.
Well, I want to ask you a couple of things about that. Someplace, I don't know if it was Kirkus or Publishers Weekly or someplace, I read the usual 3-word, the series that you come across of descriptions about your books, and it was boiled down to something like community, mercy, and karmic justice. And let me tell you, that tracks. It tracks. And not only does it track, but it includes the word that pops up when people talk about your books, and that's the idea of community, most especially mercy and karmic justice. I think if I talk about that or ask you to talk about that in terms of this novel, we're going to spoil so many things for those people out there who are reading your book. So let's stop on community. And community, I should be clear, it's about a space for everyone, but I've heard you say in interviews that tribalism, that kind of community, doesn't work. And this idea of tribalism is perhaps part of so many ills throughout American history and to the present day. But community, can you talk about the idea of community that orbits this heaven and earth grocery store and Chicken Hill? And I really ask this, it's so open-ended, I'm sorry, but I really ask this around the Venn diagram, right, of the Jewish community and the African-American community here in Pottstown, on Chicken Hill, and then even in Hemlock Rose, which is sort of separate but connected. I just wonder if you can talk about this idea of community, that people very often use that word to talk about your books.
Well, in a basic way, we're all connected. I mean, if you read Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the first 2, 3, 4 chapters of the book basically deal with the community of New Bedford, where this guy's wandering around and he sees this community. And it's not a community that, readers have ever paid attention to. Even readers now, readers say, was New Bedford really like that? It probably was. So for me, I'm always taken with the notion that, leaders and politicians and people and corporate interests who make money by showing us how different we are. That's junk food. That's cake icing and potato chips. But the people who connect us, to keep us together, are people who really do whatever they can to keep the deeper notion of community vibrant. I'll give you a living example. When Mrs. Barbara Bush was alive, she was the furthest thing from my world. I had to go to some kind of event that she gave in Manhattan because my mother really wanted to go. My mother wanted to meet her. When I went backstage, they were giving an award or something to a Mexican mother for learning to read, because Mrs. Bush started the Literacy Partners, which I'm sure is still active. But in any case, when they took this mother back there to Mrs. Bush, I saw this with my own eye. She sat down, and when Mrs. Bush started talking to her, it was like two women. They could have been sitting in Albuquerque or Brooklyn or the Bronx. They just chatted like two mothers talking about their children. And I've always been taken with the idea that if grandmothers ruled this world, a lot of this nonsense that goes on would not happen. And that, to me, is community. Now, you can place that in any framework you want. You can be real cynical and say, yeah, but blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there's a lot of blah, blah, blah in it. But the fact is, at that moment, That's the spirit. That's the same spirit that happens when Miles Davis puts his trumpet to his mouth, or Yo-Yo Ma picks up his cello and plays, or Leonard Bernstein stands in front of the New York Philharmonic and waves his baton, or Bruce Springsteen steps in front of 40,000 people at the Meadowlands and plays. Community means we are trying to get along, and we are going to do this, and we are going to be together, So does that make any sense?
It does, but I'm also thinking about the way that you write children. There's this idea that you've expressed in interviews where you say that innocence powers great writing, and it's a tool for writing. And I feel like that's different from, this idea of the Bildungsroman, right? This idea of the chipping away of innocence is the point of the story. I feel like the characters that you have, it's different. It's not the chipping away of innocence that happens, but it's the innocence itself, not what's chipped away, that is driving this. So the writing, yes, but the community in your stories. So characters like Dodo and Monkey Pants, but also Bernice again, and Hannah in the first grade, and that Robin and Sparrow chapter that I have to tell you absolutely did me in. It sort of is like this, a Little Onion in The Good Lord Bird jumps out at me now as I'm trying to ask this question. But I see the idea of innocence in your work too as part of community. So the younger folk in that community, maybe with those grandmothers or those mother figures. So just to stay on the innocence is what is driving so much in this book. And it's not this blind optimism or, a lack of maturity or a lack of discernment or a lack of questioning, but there's something else almost ineffable that frankly in 2023 is really fresh and really new to have these chapters with Bernice and Hannah in the first grade, and then later with Dodo and Monkey Pants at Penhurst. I just feel like this is something that I see that is such a part of this novel, but that is such a part of a community. And I can connect it back to Dodo at the Heaven and Earth grocery, helping out, doing his chores and all of that. I don't know. I just feel like there's something, yes, the grandmothers for sure, but the communities that exist are really for the young too. As you say, the Mexican mother, what mothers and grandmothers do for the generations to come. So I feel like it's all of a piece. That youth also, not just the youth, let's say in a camp, but also the youth within a place like Chicken Hill. I don't know. I just feel like that just jumps out at me. And I'm sorry, I'm just so long-winded and I'm not really asking a question. I
think what you're getting at is, why is it that we as adults cannot bottle up the purity that we had as children when we saw someone walking down the street who was not like us, but we liked them and we got to know them and we wanted to get to know them. And then suddenly we find ourselves separate from them because we realize they don't live on our block, they don't live on our street, they don't speak our language, they don't look like us, they're not like us. And so what happens is we, as adults, we grow these protective shells, and we use anything we need to keep that protective shell around us because we're afraid, or we've been tutored and we've been monkeyed into being afraid, so that we drive big cars that have big grills, or when in the city we live in a little box, and then we get into another little box that transports us to another little box. And we get in that little box, and then we transmit messages to millions of people saying that, this city is an urban spot. It's horrible. These things disconnect us from the things that make us human and inspire our creativity. And which is really where that's what America really is all about. What I've done in this book is just tried to show that when you do believe in the goodness of other people, and you stop looking for, stupid things to be angry about or afraid about, you find that they're pretty much just like you. And, that's really the American idea. And there is a lot of innocence in that, Now there's some of that innocence is sort of sprinkled, in a literary sense on just part of the population, when that innocence belongs to us all. So I don't know if that answers your curiosity, but that's, you know, the business of childhood innocence is something that is often abused in the literary world, because, you know, every kid is innocent. And how many stories have we read about the, you know, the poor girl who was kidnapped and she's so sweet, and then the father goes and he takes his gun out, boom, and he blows people away. You know, violence doesn't do anything. It does, you know, it doesn't do anything for stories, and it doesn't do anything in real life other than create enemies that come back later. But I mean, the purity of a mother's love, the purity of a father's attention, the purity of family, and the hard work of raising and teaching and giving children what they need. That's really what this book is about, in my opinion.
Speaking of this idea of purity, and this may not make any sense, but I think I want to ask you about marbles. Reading this book, I realized and I remembered from my childhood how special marbles are, of all things, right? The most unlikely thing, how kind of magical. My daughter is 25 years old, but she still has a small tin of marbles from her childhood. What is it about marbles, right? But small details like those in this book, sort of like your description of the train in that first story, 5 Carat Soul, but a marble in this novel, a marble of all things. And it's sort of the way that the neighborhood kids can pay for things at the grocery store, and then it becomes, I don't want to give too much away and spoil a whole bunch of things, but then there's a marble that appears later on in the book. Marbles, the small elements, the small, tiny, everyday things of a life in this book, they just become so resonant. And it goes back to this idea of the smaller and more specific the idea or the element, the more universally appreciated it can be. Right down to like a schoolroom friendship between these two neighbor girls, right? So the marbles and these small things. I'm just
Well,
amazed at the alchemy that you manage with something like that.
well, you know, you always tell a small story when you tell a good story. A good story is a small story, and the details really, you know, matter in stories. So, um, you know, these things would, you know, they were just devices that allowed characters. These are devices that allow characters to function and to move. And these devices, you know, be they a marble or an apple or a ceiling fan, or, you know, they can become symbolic if there are real characters around them that have meaning, because a simple lug wrench can mean many things. It can mean something to a car mechanic, and can mean something to a, you know, a burglar, and it can mean something else to a you know, to a mother who's learning how to take learning plumbing for the first time. So, you know, these were just devices that I used to show how we're connected.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm, you know, I'm glad to know that you know, effective, at least in your opinion, you know.
Yeah, I mean, so there was a one part where I sort of took a step back and said, "How does James McBride know what a French stitch is?" And he knows so much about stonemasonry. I mean, these sorts of details, I would always sort of take a step back and wonder about your research process, or if, these are just your powers of observation, and the way that you live your life is just know about so many things, including.
Well, I mean, I can answer that easily. You know, I was a reporter for many years. You know, I worked at the Boston Globe, at People Magazine, and my last job was at the Washington Post. And, you know, when I was 30, I quit journalism, but I didn't quit the lessons that journalism taught me, which is that you have to report deep. And then when you become a writer of books, you realize that 90% of what you use, what 90% of what you learn, you don't use. But the 10% you do use, you know, it has to be good so that the reader is tricked into believing you know what you're talking about, because I really don't. That's an old journalistic thing, you know, that, you know, journalists are like that. They're great to be around because they know a little bit about everything, but they know a lot about nothing, you know, which is kind of, but so in the case of the Heaven and Earth grocery store, I just had to do the research because you're asking the reader to suspend their disbelief, and you better make it work. Otherwise, it just sounds like it sounds quote unquote all made up.
It is a kind of a malpractice, I feel like, when those things are missing from a novel. I mean, these are the things that where you are building layers of a kind of reality, I have to say, that just adds so much. I mean, it may be one phrase in one paragraph on one page of the novel that may have taken quite a long time to cook, to be able to say something about a French stitch or a tunnel or plumbing or anything else. But I suspect that you don't have too much research to do in the area of music. I feel like that must have come, those parts of the book must have come so easily to you, the way that music is integrated here. So once again, music is very important in your book, as it seems to be in all of your books. Can you talk about the music in the book? The idea of Chick Webb, for instance, there are real world-class musicians woven into this fiction, and I just love the way you do that and the way that you did that with the Good Lord Bird, for example. But can you talk a little bit about that? And I wish there were like a Spotify playlist to accompany this book, because I'd sit there and listen to it all day, I think.
Well, I mean, because Moshe was a theater owner, and because I was fascinated with the whole idea of Yiddish theater, which was just rich and full of talent, and I got turned on to Yiddish music, klezmer music, years ago when a friend of mine named Don Byron came to Philadelphia with the New England Conservatory Klezmer Ensemble. I've always just really I like all kinds of music. I like country and western. I like all kinds of music, and so this was just an opportunity to present some of those names to people so they would maybe go back and check out who these people were. Mickey Katz and Chick Webb and so many others, Mario Bowser and the Afro-American Cuban All-Stars. And, these people were wonderful. They did great, they sounded great. And they, character, listen, when you write about music is very hard to write about. And I don't really enjoy a lot of music writing, in part because the writer gets lost in this whole business of, oh, and the sound and gosh, and the green colors and there were blue colors and orange colors. I don't want to hear that. I want to know, I want to vanish into the spirit of what the music inspires, not the music itself. The music speaks for itself. So we just want the vapors. And so what I'm trying to do is shove the vapors into the I don't want to say lyric, but into the words, into the picture.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really write about music. You just write with music, because it's not something you can really write. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting or something, or it's like a Mary Surratt. She's a great surrealist American painter. Cassatt, Mary Cassatt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just like, you can't really write about it. You just say, wow, where did she get this kid? Who is this kid and why?
Yeah.
And, that's where you start your riff,
Yeah. Well, Hannah loves to read, and you write that she read everything as a child: comics, detective books, dime novels. Then she read about socialism, unions, Jewish newspapers, publications in Hebrew, and books on Jewish life. And I start to see, I love that, by the way. I love this detail about her. But I can see something of a line from your mother, who we read about in your 1995 memoir, The Color of Water, to this character.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was really more my grandmother, but my mother as well. I mean, they were two Jewish women in the South living in, very difficult times for Jewish people in the South.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandmother, she had polio, and she worked in a store, and she married. She was in a very bad marriage, and I wanted her to be loved, so I put her on the page and made her loved. My mother had many issues as a little girl growing up in that situation in a dysfunctional household, and books were her escape. And so that made it easy. But what Hona, who I call Chona,
Mm-hmm.
some people call her Hana, whatever you will call her, I wanted to sort of shoehorn in gently the notion that there were women around this country, in particularly Jewish women, who were a lot more ahead of their time, who understood that things were going on, who were rabble rousers, people like Emma Goldman and later Belle Moskowitz and others who really, paved the way for, I mean, I'm naming just a couple. I mean, there were many, but we don't know about them. But what they did, they weren't sitting around watching television. They were reading and exchanging ideas. And a lot of that happened, or a good part of it happened in the Jewish papers and in the readings and the breakup of Judaism into the, reform and conservative and all of that business. That created a lot of people who had a lot to say. And I had to sort of try to include that in this woman's life, because without that, she wouldn't have been able to function as she did. And it's complicated business because you don't want to put too much of in it. You don't want, you have to spice these characters very carefully. You have to really allow them some space to be big, but not too big. Of course, Chona is big. I mean, she's a big character. She's huge. I mean, she carries a lot of the narrative, and she was just an accident. I mean, most she ended up in the basement of this grocery store it was just one of those things that just sort of seemed to work on the page. And she was the one who, talk about the magic of fiction. She was the one who just grew and grew. Their love just happened, for me as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And she really, pushed this story into places where I didn't expect it to go.
Wow. I love knowing this. And your book also reminds us that there was a time when polio was just a scourge. And there are two characters in this book who are afflicted with it and disabled because of it. And it's so interesting to see the different ways that they manage their lives. And this is a very important thing, I think, to think about, is that she is able to, let's see, you write there, there was not an ounce of bitterness or a shred of shame for her and her, quote, charity of mind, versus, right, a person like Doc Roberts, who, he just lacks humanity. He marches in the KKK parade and everybody knows it's him in the white sheet because of the way he walks and his girth. I think about the ways that maybe I'm not surprised that she just grew and grew, and she's such a heart of this book. But she reminds me of the ways in which, nobody's brand of misery is somehow worse than anybody else's brand of misery. And then we individually manage our lot in life, either with a kind of sheer force of will and charity, like she does, or something really negative and terrible, some poisonous thing, a lack of humanity, like we see in the doctor. So I found that so interesting to hear that there were two characters that were living with the same affliction. So that's a very important kind of thing that comes through for me as a reader, is the different ways that each one is managing their lot in life.
Well, I never thought of it that way. But although Doc Roberts is he's an antagonist, I suppose you could say. He's not presented as a sort of one-dimensional evil Scrooge. I mean, no, he has been a victim of, he has been not victimized, but he's a victim himself in a society that, doesn't really give much credence or much space to people who are quote unquote disabled. And that's one of the lessons I learned at camp, when I was working with disabled children. And also I have a niece who passed away, but she was severely disabled. And, you learn that this is just an outward cover, and that beneath the cover, everything that is human in them in you is just the same in them. And, it's just you're parked at a different radio station. That's all. And there's no great difference. I mean, Doc was a flawed man and had matters going a little to the right or a little to the left, matters that were far out of his control. He might have been a great man. And similarly with Chona, had she, had things going a little to the right or to the left, she might have been a lesser of a person, a lesser of a woman. Mm-hmm. But, the big mitigating, positive factor in her life was that she was loved. And she loved. And Doc didn't have that, not in his life. He had, he had authority and had power, and he had a family and a wife, but he didn't feel loved. And well, there it is.
Yeah, that's so true. Making it sound, I'm leading us into some dark spaces with this, with my line of questioning, but I have to say I also laughed quite a lot while I was reading, as I do when I read your books. You have such a way with humor in your writing, but it's a humor that is at its heart just human, real. I mean, life is so absurd. As a writer, what is it? Do you sort of sit there at your typewriter? And do you still use the typewriter, by the way? Do you sit there at the typewriter and just sort of
No,
laugh?
not that. I mean, I use a typewriter for the first, first 50 pages or so, and then, I give it up. In this book, I used everything. I mean, I had a hard time getting this one going. So I used typewriter, I used longhand, I used index, I used everything until I got it moving. And then by the time I diced everything out, just cleared out the decks, and with mostly I was just straight computer. But look, I like to laugh, you know. I like laughing with people who hate my guts. As long as they make me laugh, it doesn't bother me. It's okay. I mean, I'm not gonna. I mean, the absurdity of the human comedy is just funny, but not at my own expense as well. I mean, so everyone gets a little bit of shade in this book everywhere. The group, it doesn't matter, white, black, Italian, Jewish, because it's just funny, because it's true. That's the thing. I mean, there's not all of it, but there's a lot of truth to it. And a lot of the stuff that happened in this book really happened. Either in my imagination, or I read it somewhere, or I heard about something like it. I mean, this stuff is real. It's real to me. And if it's real to me, then it's usually, hopefully, real to the reader. When you're writing a novel, you are pulling out, you flicked every knob on the spaceship, and you pressed every pedal, and you yanked every button that can be yanked to make that thing go. And if it's going, you just keep doing it. You're like the guy behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz, like, pay no attention to the man behind that curtain, just keep blowing smoke until there's no more smoke to blow. That's kind of, and it should be fun, because what's the point of sharing a story if there's nothing funny and there's no fun and joy in it?
It's true. Well, I was reading an introduction to a Richard Hugo book where William Matthews says this. He says, the continuous reclamation of a hometown, the original mystifying poise between self and others, is the lifelong imaginative project of any adult. So, I sort of think about that a little bit when I pick up a new book. The continuous reclamation of a hometown is the lifelong imaginative project of any adult. And I wonder what you make of such a statement, this idea of that this is what we're always sort of chasing, or this is what drives us, or this is what moves us, or what do you think about that?
I mean, listen, I love it. Look, I've been around the world. I mean, I've been all over, both as a musician and as a writer. And, I was a college student. I spent a semester in France. I learned a lot. The main thing I learned is that, well, first of all, one of the lessons I learned is that I wish we could all make high school students spend a year abroad doing something, building wells in Peru or whatever. But we all want the same thing, essentially. All of us want the same thing. And that's we want a family, we want love, we want comfort. We all want the same thing, and how we go about getting it is, I suppose, differentiates us from one nation from the next, and one people from the next. But it's basically, we all want the same thing. We want family, we want love, we want a community. What has happened is that this sense of, when you're going back to tribalism and the business of identity, which is really where I kind of live, and that's a treacherous place to be at times, because the least word that threatens our image of ourselves is unbearable when it's uttered by someone else. But we have no trouble when that with that qualifier when it's applied to someone else in different circumstances. And that's really where a lot of the whole business of community and identity begins to become toxic and poisonous, because it really, what it translates into is that my community is better than yours, and my tribe is better than yours. My language, my way is better than yours. And in that regard, religion becomes a kind of baseball bat that people swing around to knock out anybody who's in their way in order to absolve themselves of the responsibility of caring about someone else. But I find that, love is just a lot easier. It doesn't take as much work. And laughter is the greatest gun in the world. It's the greatest cannon in the world. And, I'll go to my grave believing that. And that's really what it is. I mean, we can find fancy ways to say it, and we can write fancy laws to keep our way of life, whatever our means, in motion. But it's not going to change the inevitable desire of people to love one another and to be part of a community.
James McBride, thank you so much. What a thrill to be able to get to talk to you. What an honor. Thank you so much.
Gee, well, that's that. Those are some nice words. Just keep those. Just write me a check. I'll give you my address when it's all over. Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to talk to you. Very deep conversation.
James McBride is the author of The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. It's published by Riverhead. James McBride is the author of Deacon King Kong, the National Book Award-winning The Good Lord Bird, and the American classic, The Color of Water, as well as other novels and story collections and a biography of James Brown titled Kill 'Em and Leave. He received the National Humanities Medal, is an accomplished musician, and a distinguished writer-in-residence at New York University. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.